Professor Chester Spatt, and he's going to talk about, I think, all sorts of issues in relation to regulation with a emphasis on financial systems, I'm guessing, given your past. And so, as I said, you get half an hour. I'm going to be right in front of you, and at the end of that, take notes and jump in, and we'll have hopefully an animated conversation.
It's a great pleasure to be here today and to share with you some thoughts that I have about complexity and financial regulation. So I've been a longstanding faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University. Some of my background in this area also comes from my role as chief economist at the SEC from 2004 to 2007 under Bill Donaldson and Chris Cox. Although the primary issues that I'm going to speak of are issues that were more centrally grounded in the financial crisis, but the opportunity to have served as the SEC and in Washington as chief economist, I think has helped me broaden my perspectives in viewing the events during the financial crisis, both contemporaneously and in more recent years. Clearly, there's been considerable evolution of financial regulation, both in the midst of the financial crisis by the actions that were taken by regulators during the crisis, and then certainly in the aftermath of the financial crisis, particularly with the Dodd-Frank Act and its at least substantial implementation. Of course, our financial system is quite complex. It was quite complex before. That's illustrated, for example, by the notion that the Treasury has pushed in recent years, called a legal identity identifier, because some of the major financial services firms sometimes have 1,000 subsidiaries, and with respect to tracking transactions and understanding exposures, understanding which entities own which exposures is a substantial issue. And indeed, this really has emerged relatively centrally in some of the litigation that arose in the aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, where sometimes the counterparties, for example, were unaware as to whether their derivative contracts were booked in New York or booked in London, and that had major implications. So our financial system is quite complex. To some degree, this breeds regulation that's often complex, but I also want to argue it goes the other way around as well. And I want to emphasize, I think, something that regulators often don't appreciate. I think they would benefit to the degree possible by trying to design simple and robust approaches, and I'll sort of describe a few of these, that build from economic principles and focus on and exploit the role of economic incentives and markets. And I think perhaps the best example of this is the whole issue of bank capital, bank equity. How much equity does a financial institution have as part of its capital structure? This is an area, on the one hand, where there has been progress, where the capital standards are higher than they were pre-crisis, where some of the financial institutions were levered 30 to 1 or more. That is before their equity started to disappear, and then they were 30 to 1, quickly became 100 to 1 in some cases, of course. But I do think having high equity standards is in some ways a very robust approach. It's a very simple approach. I think it's to some degree an alternative approach. It's a way to basically get financial institutions to ultimately try to get them to bear the risk that they create. And I think that's a very important. It's certainly not an idea that's new to me, but I think it's a very important. I think it's very important, and I think to some extent it's an alternative to some of the ways in which the system has evolved. Now, of course, as I've already suggested, I think there's an important issue when we talk about complexity. I think there's a central issue of causality. Is it that the complexity in the structure of our financial system leads to complexity in regulation? And I believe to some degree that's true. But I also think it also arises in the opposite direction. The causality is often reversed. Complexity in regulation leads to complexity in structures. To some extent, the financial institutions organize themselves in response to the regulation. That's an attempt to minimize their costs, their private costs. And what do we call that in various contexts? We call that regulatory arbitrage. So if you have opportunities to deal either with different regulators with respect to particular products, or you have opportunities to organize your business in slightly different ways, obviously the businesses are going to do that. And that's central. So there's a lot of cost. This illustrates some of the types of costs that get created with intricacy in regulation, and I think there's another issue which has not gotten very much attention, and I think frankly should be the subject of a lot more attention in Washington. The complexity in regulation is a huge entry barrier. As the compliance costs have increased dramatically, this leads to consolidation. Now, historically, in our society more broadly, we've often been concerned about too much consolidation in various industries because of antitrust concerns. But somewhere this seems to have disappeared from the radar in this space. And indeed, in the financial crisis itself, this was even a tool of the principal regulators. Just consider the case of Bank of America and its acquisition of Merrill Lynch. So here you have a situation at the peak, admittedly at the peak of the crisis, but so in effect mergers were part of the bailout too. And what you had during the crisis is some of the major players got relatively bigger. And in effect, the future is left to fend for itself. Well, now we're in the future. I think what regulators said in that period of time was, well, we have to kind of get past the next day. We have to prevent the world from disappearing the next day. Okay, well, that happened. I mean, we survived. But I think it's also important to think of these as dynamic problems, and to kind of recognize that dynamic and intertemporal incentives are very important. Indeed, two of my former Carnegie Mellon colleagues, Finn Kydland and Ed Prescott, received the Nobel Prize more than a decade ago for their work highlighting the importance of time consistency. And while this in policy and the importance of government recognizing that they're playing against strategic actors, and it's important to follow consistent policies. So one of my takeaways from this is that dealing with the financial crisis can actually help lead to sustaining and even enhancing too big to fail institutions rather than addressing it. And I think this is a theme that's frankly underappreciated by financial regulators. So what do I see as more broadly some of the consequences of this? Well, I think the extent of complexity may be excessive. I think regulators could do better in accomplishing their goals. In fact, I want to emphasize, I think, quite legitimate goals, by relatively simple standards and principles to force more internalization within the firms. And yet I think there's been relatively little effort to utilize robust alternatives. So I want to just drill down a little bit on the example of bank capital or equity. So I certainly think it's higher than before the financial crisis, but I also think it's perhaps not at levels for banks to fully internalize all their risk-taking costs. And at times I think there's even very simple ways to do this. One of the levers that the Federal Reserve has, for example, is on how much dividends it allows banks to distribute. And for the most part, except when banks have failed the stress test, basically the Federal Reserve has simply gone along with whatever the major banks have proposed with respect to dividends. But when resources are paid out as dividends, those resources are no longer available, and instead the seniority of the taxpayer to potentially provide a future bailout becomes relatively higher. What too big to fail is, as I think everybody here appreciates, what too big to fail, of course, means is that the government or the central bank backstops the financial institutions. To some degree, I think high capital is a solution to too big to fail, or at least it mitigates too big to fail. Now, one of the main criticisms that banks point to with respect to this issue is that they argue that equity is inherently more expensive than debt. And, while on its face this has some intuitive appeal, I want to note that this is basically completely inconsistent with basic principles of markets. And I think the basic principles by which banks and other financial advisors advise their clients. That is, at the margin, you'd expect a dollar of funding would have similar cost. However, it's labeled. If that were not the case, then the financial institution can redesign its capital structure to lower its cost. Now, there is let me emphasize at the same time, there is an important distinction between social and private costs. So perhaps what banks and financial institutions have in mind when they say that debt is less costly is that they have in mind various government subsidies associated with debt that are not present for equity. And I think if you focus in on those subsidies, yeah, that is less costly. But that's kind of a consequence of how we've designed our system. This distinction between the social and the private costs, and in particular, I have in mind two costs. So one cost is our tax law makes debt deductible and doesn't provide similar preference for equity. But that's something in principle that one can fix. Now, I'm not suggesting that therefore one sort of starts out by redesigning the whole tax system. But the point is that debt that there's different ways to design things, and if basically the government is allowing favorable pricing for one instrument versus another, then we shouldn't wrap our financial system around that with respect to the extent to which we then need to bail out large institutions. And this shows up maybe more directly in the context of the financial crisis, because, of course, the potential for bailouts artificially lowers the cost of debt, because the government guarantees play a central role. So that also leads to an important distinction between the social and private costs. During the financial crisis, I think especially especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the markets really appreciated that there was the possibility that the owners of debt appreciated the possibility that they might get paid, even though the financial institutions didn't have the resources. On the other hand, I think the equity holders knew that they were going to lose, and so this was actually part of the problem. That debt was cheap, and there wasn't much equity in the institutions. Requiring much higher capital is I think, a relatively simple and robust approach. The approach, on the other hand, of Dodd-Frank is to focus much more upon the specifics of the bankruptcy code. The way bankruptcy worked for financial institutions, I think, was viewed by many observers as not completely satisfactory, it's sort of fair to say, during the financial crisis. And so Dodd-Frank created a new system of resolution authority, sort of basically an alternative to the bankruptcy code. They required the banks to create living wills. these documents, these documents are still going through the vetting and editing process. We've now gone through several rounds of this, and basically, so far, the regulators have rejected the filings of the banks. I think to some extent, what this reflects is that it's very hard to get one's hands around what is the nature of the structure. I think the nature of the feedback from the regulators to the banks and the complexity of the documents that the banks drafted, I think all illustrate the complexity of the structure, the complexity of knowing how to get one's hands around it, the fact that there are many subsidiaries, the fact that you're also dealing with many jurisdictions in a bankruptcy. So in effect, the issue of resolution is really an issue of for a global player, it's an issue of global resolution. How are the laws in different countries going to interact? These are huge issues and huge challenges. Global institutions and many national regulatory structures, these are fundamental sources of complexity. Meanwhile, you have considerable regulatory competition across countries and relatively little coordination, and this all adds to the mix. I think another interesting example is the case of stress tests. Here, what I'll just note is that the stress tests have occurred in two forms. One is the stress tests created by the Federal Reserve, and the other is the Federal Reserve's oversight of the banks and asking the banks to do their own stress tests. I think I think these are potentially important. I think a key aspect of this is having the banks do their own, and this is part of it. And the reason I think this is key is because it's important that the financial institutions have good risk management capacity, and this is, I think, one of the lessons of the financial crisis, that at the time of the crisis, that certainly good risk management was sorely lacking. So let me turn to the Volcker Rule, one of the more controversial aspects of Dodd-Frank. So this bans proprietary trading by major financial institutions. And I think part of what was envisioned in Volcker was simple and clear-cut. The easy part was to spin off proprietary trading and hedge fund desks. That seems like relatively well-defined and relatively clear-cut. And the basic idea was you didn't want these financial institutions using deposit guarantees and Fed guarantees to support their trading. The challenging aspect, however, is the question of what does it really mean? What does proprietary trading fully mean? What is the relationship between that and market making? So these financial institutions, they're in the business of being a dealer. That's one of their key businesses. Well, a key aspect of that is to trade to facilitate your customer's business, to help your customers, or to be at least positioned to take the other side of what your customer wants you to do. So what's happened in the evolution of the Volcker Rule is that metrics were developed to measure what facilitating customer business means. But inherently, these are incredibly complex, and much of the complexity about Volcker is about this issue. It's not particularly about spinning off the proprietary trading desk or the hedge fund desk, but once you sort of do that, that's the easy stuff. Once you do that, what does it mean if an entity is functioning as a dealer in illiquid assets? And I think that's been a really challenging feature. Of course, the purpose of Volcker was to prevent the presence of too big to fail guarantees applying to prop trading. It was not intended to impact market making. That's the stated purpose everybody points to. But ironically, which class of securities is exempt from Volcker? Treasury securities, of course. Those U.S. government bonds. The Treasury, they don't particularly want, they want to keep the cost of funding down for the taxpayers. Very appropriately so. I'm glad they're looking out for us. So the treasuries are exempt to avoid raising their trading costs. And then other sovereigns, of course, they sought exemptions too. Well, this points to the problem with Volcker. It's not intended to impact market making, but the Treasury thinks it's going to impact market making in its instruments. Well, and too bad about the other guys. And again, I think high capital, maybe it's not a full solution, but it seems to me pushing on the capital lever seems to me a way to internalize the cost and risk incentives. in many cases, there are alternative solutions. There are alternative approaches. And I think regulators appreciate that. And sometimes, in fact, they try to tackle the same problem in multiple ways. Now, this is a tricky issue. And I'm not arguing that they shouldn't tackle the same problem in different ways, but there are some key issues to keep in mind when regulators do this, when regulators approach the same issue in multiple ways. These different ways, they might be imperfect substitutes. So if it's a really important issue, we might want to tackle it in different ways, and no problem with that. But we have to be careful about how we count the benefits and the costs. When people usually measure the costs of different regulations, usually what they have in mind are costs that are, you have the cost of this regulation, you have the costs created by this regulation, and usually those costs are additive. But sometimes the benefits that people have in mind, if they're trying to deal with the same problem, the benefits might be the same, or at least somewhat duplicative. So that's a tricky issue. In effect, there's diminishing returns to multiple approaches. And I think that's something important to keep in mind as we assess regulations. And I want to sort of apply this next to credit rating agencies. So how did credit rating agencies get addressed under Dodd-Frank? So on the one hand, Dodd-Frank followed two different, somewhat different, maybe almost not quite contradictory, that's too strong, but followed two different kind of approaches. So on the one hand, Dodd-Frank removed regulatory references to ratings, basically limited the ability of the SEC, the Federal Reserve, et cetera, to reference ratings in their regulations. This limits, for example, the ability of the rating agencies to sell the regulatory treatment. It limits the extent to some degree of systemic risk when the rating agencies are misjudging risk. In effect, it could allow more flexibility to the rating agencies to set their own norms and definitions and encourages competition. And sort of a lot of that may be to the good, but it works in sort of one particular kind of direction. And what's the alternative approach? Also supported in Dodd-Frank. The alternative approach is to have tighter supervision, or sometimes what I say is to have the regulators sit on top of the rating agencies more because they did such a bad job. So on the one hand, they did a bad job, so we're going to sit on top of them more. And on the other hand, they did a bad job, so we're not going to use their services. These are not, it's not fully contradictory, but a little bit inconsistent. And it seems to me at times our regulatory system is sort of pulling in different ways. And it was interesting when I looked at at one point I looked at the roll call votes in the Senate on removing references to ratings, that was the Lemieux Amendment, and also on trying to address aggressively the issue of regulatory shopping through the Franken Amendment. And it was interesting that both of these had strong support. Both of these had at least 60 senators behind them, actually. But to some extent, the coalitions were different, but there were 30 senators who supported both. And it was interesting to sort of see, how this was sort of viewed in the political landscape. So I want to turn next to the issue of how do government officials think about market information? Well, you could argue, on the one hand, they really liked market information prior to Dodd-Frank. Why do I say that? Because they simply outsourced a lot of regulation to the rating agencies before Dodd-Frank. And you can sort of think of that, they like what markets had to say. On the other hand, frankly, there's huge suspicion of the markets. There's huge suspicion of the information arising from sovereign credits and other contexts. Criticism for when the rating agencies downgrade countries, the countries they weigh in kind of forcefully. The U.S. was rather annoyed, it's sort of fair to say, when S&P downgraded them. Italy was rather annoyed when Moody's downgraded them, and I think apparently the police raided Moody's offices in the aftermath. The U.S. didn't quite do that, but Tim Geithner did appear on the Sunday talk shows to say some not very nice things about S&P. In Europe, later in around 2011, they banned naked credit default swaps and short-selling financials because of suspicion of the information being generated. Yet at the same time, government officials sometimes want to manipulate demand. Sometimes they try to weigh in on what a credit event is in the CDS. In Europe, they defined a zero risk weight in the European Union and the application of Basel for sovereign credit. I mean, what does it mean to say that there's no risk associated with a sovereign credit? Basically, I think it's a vehicle to try to give your sovereign credit a regulatory advantage over all the other instruments. And even you could argue the purchase of European sovereigns by the ECB is certainly an attempt to manipulate demand. Central clearing of derivatives. This has clearly led to a fundamental redesign of markets. I think most observers, myself included, have been sympathetic to this. But again, there's a lot of buried bodies here. I think the high-level idea of netting and transparency of the exposures, this is really a great idea. This is really important and useful. And we obviously didn't have much of this in the financial crisis. Although some of the things people point to in the financial crisis were actually things like the AIG derivatives, which were not standardized and this wouldn't have applied to anyway, but we'll put that aside. But where are some of the problems here? And will CCPs actually reduce systemic risk? I think the answer to this is not so clear. Well, first of all, if you would think it would reduce systemic risk, market participants would respond and might increase risk-taking and exposure to the clearinghouses anyway. So there's an endogeneity issue, which is important, and I think is sort of largely lost in the debate. The presence of CCPs creates an incentive to trade with weak counterparties because of the nature of the pricing. There's huge concentration of risk in the CCP. And on this, I think there's been a lot of tendency to sort of ignore this. They're the ultimate too big to fail institution, potentially. If we're worried about too big to fail, how can we not worry about the CCP? Now, people say, well, the CCPs haven't failed in the past. Well, in a few countries they have, but we'll put that aside. But I should also note that the notion of netting, it doesn't really quite work as simply as one would think. The notion of netting all these different contracts, if the interest rate swaps and the CDS swaps and various other derivatives, if they were all going through the same clearing entity, there would be much more netting than if they're in different places. So now you've got a situation where you've got one set of exposures in one clearing entity, different set of exposures in a different clearing entity. Would we be better served if all of the exposures between Morgan Stanley and Goldman were being netted against each other? I mean, this is an alternative, and it's really, I think, almost an empirical question. I thought an interesting summary of some of these issues was a statement that Ben Bernanke made when he was chair of the Fed. He quoted a Mark Twain character, with a very interesting quote. And in fact, it got picked up, it's been interpreted in a whole variety of ways, both supportive and critical of central clearing. He quoted a Mark Twain character named Puffingham Wilson as saying, if you put all your eggs in one basket, you better watch that basket. Now, what does that mean? On the one hand, you could view it as, therefore, this approach in Dodd-Frank of central clearing was crazy because it put all the eggs in one basket. On the other hand, you could view it as saying, the chairman of the Fed saying, it's important to watch the basket, and it's important for us, the Fed, to watch the basket because we're the ones who are able to watch. So there's obviously different interpretation of what the quote means, but obviously it's pointing to this huge issue. Oops. Oh, what did I do? I hit something. It blacked out on me. Okay. So cost-benefit analysis. So this is to some extent, could be a simple and robust perspective. My view is it should be a central criteria for rule adoption, and it's gotten more force, particularly by some rulings from the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, basically because, and I think some of this happened, some of the force to this happened because in the period of time when I was in Washington, the SEC basically completely ignored this issue. The Circuit Court slapped it in 2005 and sort of largely ignored this. And so when the next case came along in 2011, which was the early Dodd-Frank case on proxy access, the court was very aggressive. Now, are there ways to do cost-benefit here? I think there are. On some issues, one could do more in the way of natural or randomized experiments, more focus, I think, on before and after. Very little effort even now in looking back at the data after we implement regulation. What do we learn? So some of it would be before and after comparisons, but some of it could be after we implement it, what happens then? And indeed, even perhaps at some point we sunset the rules, we pull the rule back if we're not sure, and then we can see what happens then. And I think that I think trying to look more systematically. Now, this doesn't necessarily work for the largest of the systemic risk issues, but I do think cost-benefit analysis is potentially very important. Transparency and disclosure. So I think this is an important theme. Public meetings. I think public meetings of the regulators are very important. In the case of the Federal Reserve, there's actually been very few. I think this is important for public understanding about liquidity, bankruptcy risk, and the like. I think it's important also to facilitate feedback in the rulemaking process. Regulators often discourage disclosure of firm-specific actions. And I'll point to two concrete examples of this. At the heart of the financial crisis, in December 2008, as the Merrill Lynch acquisition of Merrill was at the crucial stage, the Fed and the Treasury basically sat on Bank of America and basically sat on the CEO to not make too much disclosure. And they basically told him, if you make more disclosure and then things go badly, we're not going to have confidence in you. And so they were pretty direct about this. And this was then the subject of a lot of congressional testimony, kind of in some ways kind of remarkable congressional testimony. But I think disclosure is very, very important. Indeed, in the initial round of stress tests, so these weren't the Dodd-Frank stress tests, but in the ones at the heart of the crisis in 2009, initially, the regulators were ambivalent about whether they were going to disclose the results. First, they wanted to see the results. I think they first wanted to see the results before deciding to disclose. But frankly, I don't think that's really how it works. I mean, you want markets to be convinced of the integrity of what you're doing, and if you first wait to see the results, I think that's kind of crazy. So on the theme of simple versus complex rules, let me just point out that I think full disclosure is much simpler than incomplete disclosure, and I think to the better. Simple rules also avoid a lot of needless distortions. When you have complex rules and people are trying to fit into different baskets, a little like in my earlier comments about regulatory arbitrage, that leads to a lot of disclosure, a lot of distortion. I think markets are very, very important. And finally, my summary slide simply points to many of the themes that I've talked about already, and so I think in the interest of time, this basically just points to some of the themes in my talk, so I'll just sort of leave it at that. And then finally, a few years ago, I did a short text version exploring some of these issues in a piece called Complexity of Regulation that was in the Harvard Business Law Review. So I thought I would just mention that as well. Let me stop here. I've actually run over a couple of minutes. So let me stop here and open it up for questions.
So are you okay fielding the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm all ready for questions. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, so I should call on the. Okay, sorry, I should call on people. Now I see what Senator Udall was saying last night about the lights. I didn't understand. Yeah, thank you. I didn't understand. I didn't quite understand. Yeah. Now I see the problem. Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Or I don't see the problem. Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much, Jillian Hadfield. So I want to point out a tension in some of what you said. So. I think many of us are completely. I'm an economist and a law professor. Completely on board with the idea that the fact that a system is complex doesn't mean that we want complex rules to govern it, that we may want simpler rules, and we're trying to accomplish that. So I think that's a very important observation. I think the question is, do the systems that currently produce our rules and regulations, can they maintain simplicity in equilibrium? So we can design them. So what I want to point out too is a little bit of a tension between, on the one hand, really kind of putting forward what is really a central planning type solution that says, hey, let's all realize, let's look around the room. Can't we all get along? Simple rules would work better. and put them in place. We actually know that the equilibrium in most of our legal systems, whether you're looking at common law reasoning or the political process that produces regulations and legislation, all the pressures go to the opposite, was increasing elaboration, increasing levels of complexity. You mentioned regulatory competition, which, as we know, is competition in the way we think of it now between states. But globally, is that one of the things we should be thinking about? That, you know, can we perhaps get some market pressure for more stable, simple systems by increasing the amount of regulatory competition?
Yeah. So I think that was a very insightful question with a lot of interesting insights, both explicit and implicit. Let me just try to address a few. Let me try to comment on a few points. So I think you're raising an interesting point. So I advocated in my remarks more focus on simplicity and offered, I think, a few examples where simplicity would perhaps be helpful and where complexity has been counterproductive. What your observation is, well, that may not really be a full equilibrium, because if the regulators went to kind of too simple a system, there would be lots of efforts to find the little holes in between. I think that's a fair point. I think that's a very fair point. With respect to the issue across countries, so I think to some extent this is a little bit about how it's played out, even in terms of the regulatory competition. The U.S. has made a lot of grand pronouncements in this space, to some extent under the leadership of President Obama, and to some extent because of Dodd-Frank, or because of even before Dodd-Frank was adopted, because of the expectation of the adoption of Dodd-Frank. In fact, maybe one of the kind of ironically for me, being in Pittsburgh, perhaps one of the most important venues in which that happened was what's called the Pittsburgh meeting of the G20 in September 2009, where there were lots of promises, and mostly promised by the various countries about what they would do, and mostly undelivered upon. And I think undelivered upon, maybe in part because of some of what your question is getting at, of the issue of regulatory competition across countries, and that's a very difficult issue to deal with. I think probably part of the purpose of the G20 effort was to try to coordinate on that. But like in context in industrial organization, there's lots of incentives for members of the cartel to cheat. And here it's not the oil cartel. Here it's the regulatory cartel. And I think is sort of an interesting point that I think your question highlighted.
The dirty little secret is that many of the established financial institutions stay in business because of the regulatory burden that prevents startups from breaking in and creating meaningful competition. And yet just adding more regulation or simplifying the regulation is not enough to break that logjam. So do you have any thoughts into how to allow the system to reinvent itself by creating a path to doing business for smaller companies who cannot afford to go through the regulatory burden?
So again, a very interesting and insightful question. I think it's a tough issue. My Carnegie Mellon colleague Alan Meltzer is a big advocate of a bill that's pending in the Senate, the Brown-Vitter bipartisan bill, by the way, the Brown-Vitter bill, which basically calls for much higher capital standards for large institutions, but not for smaller institutions. And I think the notion that underlies this, in part, I mean, some of it has to do with high capital for these large players. But I think some of it has to do with trying to figure out how to create maybe more market incentives where perhaps institutions would spin off activities, but whether, if that bill were passed, it's still an issue of where you would draw the lines. Would you be able to create those incentives? And indeed, these institutions, the largest institutions, they're so far over the sort of thresholds in this type of legislation that it's maybe hard to imagine that type of legislation even would have marginal effects on those big players. And indeed, the question is, how do you, legislation, it's sort of a often be a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and regulation is often a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's I think quite problematic. So, I think the point you're raising it relates to kind of one of the early themes of my presentation, of course, basically about complex regulation being a huge regulatory barrier. So, and I think it may well be that the big financial institutions are talking out of both sides of their mouth on this issue. They may be providing. I suspect I think they're probably providing candid feedback on how they feel about particular regulations. But I think, on the other hand, I think they also, so sometimes critical feedback about particular regulations, but I think they also recognize that these can actually be a huge competitive advantage to it. And I think it is a big. I would agree with you that it is potentially a big. It is potentially a big challenge. I will point out that when we have crises, we shouldn't view it as free to let these institutions get a little larger. And that's kind of the approach that was taken in the financial crisis. And I think that was unfortunate. I think that was sort of very unfortunate, because I think the whole approach during the financial crisis was to view everything about today, and not to sort of think about the long run. But I thought a little bit about these issues in sort of some other spaces. So one of the sub areas that I've specialized in a little bit in recent years is the area of credit rating agencies. I've sponsored a series of conferences in that space, and I have a Sloan Foundation grant now that's sort of at its latter stages, and I've written a couple of papers in that space. Credit rating agencies are kind of an interesting issue, because you look at what happened in the financial crisis. Before the financial crisis, everybody said, "Oh, the rating agencies, they're going to give their best judgment, because the reputation is everything in that business, and so liability is not so important anyway." And there wasn't liability anyway, but at least pre-Dodd-Frank, there wasn't liability, and Dodd-Frank's effort at liability basically collapsed on the day after Dodd-Frank was passed, effectively. But the rating agencies, this is a reputation business. Well, who could have done worse during the financial crisis than the rating agencies? I mean, their models performed awfully, but yet what happened in the aftermath? Is it now that people disregard ratings? No. I mean, people still regard ratings as important. I mean, in the business, I'm not talking about regulation, but in business, ratings are they still important? Sure. And are the main players different? No. We still have, so it's true that instead of having 5 NRSROs, we have 10 NRSROs. Okay. But that's largely because of the 2006 law, which changed which allowed a little bit more entry at a formal level. But is it basically still a 3-firm industry? Absolutely. And has a big new entrant? Has a big new player emerged? No, not really. And I'll point to another example: the accounting industry, the accounting/auditing industry. So we went from, with the collapse of Arthur Andersen and the aftermath of Enron, we went from Big 5 to Big 4. And then 2 observations about this. So first of all, one observation is, so at some point KPMG provided tax advice that I think was viewed by the Justice Department as over the top, and the Justice Department started to bring a case about this in 2005. And then when the career prosecutors favored doing that, but when it got to the higher levels, I think the senior leadership at Justice was very concerned that they didn't want to go from Big 4 to Big 3. And I think some of those concerns were well justified because of concerns about competitiveness in the industry. But it raises an interesting question. So, if KPMG were taken down, So why did people suspect that a new firm wouldn't have emerged? And I think they're probably right. Probably a new firm wouldn't have emerged. Certainly nothing emerged in the aftermath of Arthur Andersen. Again, the same issue. So for some of these global firms, the implicit entry barriers must be huge in terms of forming this firm. And I think it's very much so. The credit rating agencies, the auditing firms, I think it's also kind of so your question was framed in terms of the banks, and more of my talk was framed that way. But I don't feel like I have a good answer to that. Yeah.
Bengt Holmstrom just won the Nobel Prize in economics a few weeks ago. He's at MIT. And he talks about cases in which less transparency actually makes for more efficient markets than greater transparency. The specific example he cites is De Beers diamonds. De Beers sells diamonds wholesale to retailers in bags that are sealed. The retailers can't see what's in the bags. If they could open the bags, they'd open them up and choose the best diamonds, and then you'd have to put a price on each and every diamond, which is a lot more expensive and less efficient than if you can trust the seller that it's a random sample or a representative sample of diamonds in the closed bag, just buying the bag. It reminds me of how I buy tomatoes at Costco. They sell them in open little packages, and Costco had so many customers like me who choose the best tomatoes from each of several different packages and put them in a single package that they now seal the packages in plastic. Anyway, to what extent do you see this principle of a trade-off between efficiency and transparency working in financial markets, and/or where do you see it applying?
So again, a very interesting and very thoughtful question. So first, I'll take the easy part of the question. So I'm a big fan of Costco, but I haven't had very good luck with the fruit. I have had awful luck with the fruit there. It seems it has a lot shorter shelf. I personally find it has a lot shorter shelf life than in my supermarket. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I'm a big fan of Costco. So don't. Okay. So, and I'm also a big fan of Bengt. Bengt's an incredible scholar. So, but I disagree. I do disagree with him. So, I do disagree with Bengt a bit on this issue. And I think the example that you described of the diamonds, that's a terrific example, and that example matches completely Bengt's story. So where do I think his story breaks down? So his story basically is one that we shouldn't have transparency, because transparency in effect segments the markets. It leads to a lot of adverse selection. It gets in the way of effective pricing. And if we can basically have an effect in the language of economics, if we have a pooling equilibrium, that's going to be much more effective. So I mean, I think it's a good argument on its face, but I question a bit the relevance in some of the markets. And in particular, let's take the case of mortgage securities trading. Well, it would be great if nobody would have any kind of information about what's inside the packages. But okay, maybe I don't collect information about what's inside the packages, but if Goldman's on the opposite side of me, why do I think they're not going to have information about what's inside the packages? Unless somehow I can really suppress that information. Now, I guess in the diamond example, maybe there's sort of a way to kind of ensure the integrity, and I guess the key is to ensure the integrity of the package. In the diamond example, of course, it would be to ensure the integrity of the packages. So I think in the mortgage, and I've thought a lot about mortgage issues, really, even going back to the 1980s, long before credit was an issue. What was striking to me there, even in the context involving mortgages and prepayments, there were people who were more sophisticated, less sophisticated. There would be instruments in mortgages. So even in the 1980s, so there were no credit issues, no big credit issues in mortgages, but lots of issues about prepayment risk and the variation in that. And what did we observe? We observed that when folks had goods, the mortgage securities that were really valuable, what would they do? They wouldn't sell them as part of a generic price. They would trade them on special. They would trade them, and they would provide lots of information about the particular things that they were offering. And so what did that mean for the rest of it? Well, it meant that the rest of it was the generic stuff. And that would tend to have a little bit lower price. And so I think there is a little bit of an endogeneity issue between being in the segmented market and the pooled market. And I think that's where I think the weakness is in the argument.
It strikes me that one of the fundamental issues here is a trade-off between the social value that financial institutions, large or small, create, and the externalities that they create in the form of systemic risk. And so the one question is, can we sufficiently internalize the cost of those externalities to get to an efficient solution? And if the answer to that question is no, because it's too complex or for other reasons, do we need to have government decide what the optimal mix of social value and externalities are? And I don't have any answers, but I worry that when we rely heavily on something as simple as let's just have higher capital standards, that we're not necessarily making as good a decision as we could. And I'll just give you a simple hypothetical. Imagine for a minute, if everyone could just assume that the US government has strong credit. Imagine for a minute that a company that we call a bank buys $1 billion of US government bonds maturing exactly 10 years from now. And that bank borrows from the bond market, and only from the bond market, $999 million, which is due 10 years and 1 day from now. It doesn't strike me, if you agree, at least for now, that the US government is sound credit, it doesn't strike me that that is an over-leveraged institution. And so by limiting the leverage that institution could take, that's a socially suboptimal outcome. And so I wonder whether we need to dig deeper and think more about that balance between externalities and social value, and be as simple and transparent as possible, but not too simple that we miss out on some social value.
Well, I think that's fair. I think both the example you're laying out and the criticism is a fair point. I think what I would emphasize that I'm trying to get at is that I think in the way policy has been handled over both in the crisis and in the aftermath, there's perhaps not been enough focus on the virtues of simplicity, and not enough focus on the consequences of complexity. But I think this comes back. This kind of relates a bit, in some ways, to the initial question as well. And I think you're offering a persuasive argument that if there are going to be some latent externalities present, we perhaps can't simply just rely on high capital. I think that's a fair. I think that's a fair point. But I think it is an issue about relative emphasis, and relative emphasis particularly compared to what policy is now and how it was also during the crisis. So I don't disagree with the point of your question, but and I view it as a reasonable critique. But I think there's a balancing issue, and I think the third alternative is sort of what policy has been, and I think that could be improved on by taking much more seriously the issues of simplicity, internalization, trying to have robust approaches, and the like. Yeah.
Thinking about regulation as software, and maybe this goes back to your cost-benefit analysis slide. I mean, we we wouldn't release a big piece of software into the wild without doing a lot of testing of it. So the first question is, do you think that there's enough transparency, or could you imagine enough transparency such that simulations would give you a reasonable idea of how the regulation might actually behave in the wild? And then the second question is, in your experience, are people in government making enough use of sort of big data analytics, for lack of a better word, or sophisticated machine learning and data analysis tools to actually analyze market behavior and to analyze regulatory performance?
Okay, so let me try to address both. So part of the question was about testing in the wild, and part of it was about big data and government and what regulators do. So on testing in the wild, I probably agree to a fair degree with many incumbent regulators that it's, on the one hand, it's hard to do testing, and for some of the issues, probably it's impossible. But on the other hand, I think they also haven't done enough of it. So the one case when I was at the SEC, we did this. Now this is a context I'll say in the little as opposed to in the big, but we were evaluating whether to remove uptick restrictions on short sales, which we did, and which, by the way, at the time was non-controversial. And I think from the perspective of today is probably again non-controversial. But at some point along the way, it got blamed for the financial crisis, even by Senator McCain at the heart of the presidential campaign. I think when one can do testing, I think that's a good thing. I think pilot studies can be a good thing. I don't think it works. I don't think it certainly works in every context. I think for some equity structure issues, it probably works pretty well because you get a lot of high frequency data. You can do different things in different buckets. But if the test is the whole economy, how do you do that? And so there I'm probably more sympathetic to the regulators. At the same time, I've actually been critical that they didn't do enough, that sometimes there were places, maybe again a little bit in the small, where they could have done more. So about 4 years ago, I was discussant of an academic paper that looked at issues involving a commercial paper funding facility that was introduced by the Fed at the heart of the crisis as one of a number of liquidity tools. And one of the the academics who were analyzing this, they did a perfectly nice job with respect to identification and trying to tease things out, but they had relatively little to work with, given how the setup was designed. And one of the things I pointed out in my discussion was, gee, it was really too bad that the Fed didn't view this thing as an opportunity to learn too. And that I argued what they should have done is the eligibility standard shouldn't have been, the problem was the eligibility was based upon whether you were borrowing commercial paper before. So you really didn't have you didn't really have a clean randomized kind of treatment kind of effect at all. And so then I was asked, well, what would I expect regulators to do in the crisis? Shouldn't they be managing for today? And I said, well, partially they should be managing for today, but they should be managing for tomorrow too. And if there's, and so with respect to this sort of issue, what I thought was, okay, they could do some randomization. They didn't have to do complete randomization. They could have eligibility criteria that were a little different. So maybe you have one group that's 70-30 and you have the other group that's 30-70, maybe based upon what they did in the past. But you could still generate samples and you could generate information. And that was sort of, so I sort of feel like even sometimes even on the Fed types of issues that more could be done. But it's hard. And on the bigger issues, how do we do a randomized experiment about suppose we handle Lehman Brothers differently, or suppose we handled AIG differently. Obviously, I think about the only thing I could say about that would be, we should try to be clear about what we're going to do. And one of the problems I remember on this issue was the Fed sent one set of signals at the time of Bear Stearns, and then sent a completely different set of signals at the time of Lehman Brothers. And the problem was that the Bear Stearns signals didn't provide enough didn't provide enough headway into their thinking for laymen, and so the layman guys, they were clueless, and well, now their own fault that they were clueless too. I'm not blaming the Fed on this certainly, but you know, they didn't take enough steps to try to get their funding house in order. So that's on experiments in the wild, and big data and what the government's doing. So I should say that my main experience in government service is kind of stale. I was at the SEC from 2004 to 2007. Now, we did this really great thing with the short sale data, and that was, I think, really nice. Mostly, did we have much big data then? No, not really. And certainly the SEC's data capacities in that era were unfortunately not as strong as they could be. My sense from interaction with the current staff is that that's kind of revved up quite a bit. And I think they're better positioned. How well positioned they are and the Fed is, and it's hard to judge as an outsider. I think there is more effort along these lines. Obviously, in the case of stress testing at the Fed, for example, by the nature of that program, they've kind of had to be much more serious about trying to get into the granular details of data. But it's hard for me, even though I've been on several advisory committees in these various spaces, it's hard for me to really judge this. My sense is there's been a lot of improvement, but you know, how does it compare to the private sector on an absolute basis is hard for me to judge.
Did you mention earlier, sorry, I didn't hear your whole talk. Did you mention Department of Labor regs that are coming out?
No, I didn't at all.
So this is the most sweeping set of regulations that I've ever seen in my 34 years on Wall Street. And this is the one that most directly affects Main Street. People have seen all these regulations being passed, but this is generally being passed around between government agencies and Wall Street firms. Now we have something that is going to be the biggest wave to ever hit consumers, and I'm still trying to figure out how this is supposed to benefit John Q. Public. The regs which come out in April, which are employed in April.
Well, let me not weigh in. Let me not weigh in. I mean, the Labor Department regs I do think are very important. At the same time, let me say that I haven't studied them very closely. I haven't otherwise weighed in on them, so I don't know that I want to sort of form a position kind of on the fly in responding to the question. You know, I think the broad issue that's being raised is the issue about advice. And what is the nature, what are the legal standards associated with the advice that consumers are being provided? Obviously, we have a lot of different structures for different products and the like, and the Labor Department standards are going to apply to the products that they regulate under ERISA. It does seem to me that the core issue, not so much in terms of what the Labor Department should do or the like, but I do think the core issue here is actually one of education. But I don't know that I have no obvious solution to this. But there are a few basic principles of finance that it's too bad that more investors don't appreciate. The notion, for example, of passive investing, the importance of cost, the importance of diversification. Some of these principles, I think, can get one to a pretty decent place with respect to structuring their portfolio, even perhaps with a lot of very explicit advice. But that's easy for me to say. After all, I'm a finance professor. But I do think a lot of the issues are sort of education. But people need. But this is, the role of brokers on the one hand and advisors on the other hand, is to help to some extent guide people, different legal obligations associated with these different roles, of course. Is regulation going to get us there? I don't know. I'm certainly a little bit skeptical. I don't know that there's an obvious way for Washington to be able to help on the education front. It may be too bad that there isn't, but it's not clear to me how one could be effective. I thought a little bit about this when I was chief economist at the SEC. But I couldn't figure out any way to galvanize the attention of America's investors with respect to this. I mean, I think probably the person who's perhaps done the most in this regard, I would say, is perhaps Jack Bogle in creating the set of products that he created at Vanguard 40 years ago. And I do think, when you look, there has been a fair amount of evolution in what people invest in, and it may be that these issues become smaller over time. But I think with respect to the Labor Department issues, I just don't have enough knowledge of the trade-offs and the like.
Let's have one more question, then I'm going to have a mini question, Ross, and then we'll take a little break.
Yeah.
Hello. I'm on a bank board, so I'm kind of at a good-sized bank, $5 billion plus. So I'm on the receiving end of this regulation, and you went over it pretty quickly that we haven't seen consolidation, right? And so I've got a question for you is, being on the end of this, and we take it very seriously, and I agree with your comments, it's all about risk. It really, a good organization has to manage risk, especially in the banking. But the only reason there hasn't been consolidation is because of the interest rate environment. I mean, banks don't make any money right now. And, your comment on I cannot tell you the regulatory burden on a bank. And you're just talking about the financial restrictions. There is fair lending, which is great from a social point of view, but now there's, we have to monitor every transaction that goes through the bank from a terrorist point of view, and the number of people, and being an entrepreneur, I find it stunning, the amount of regulation. So I guess the point I'm making is, one of the premises I'd like to ask you about is consolidation seems to be the only rational way for small and medium-sized community banks to exit this strategy, because the regulatory burden is an enormous burden, and whether it's a side effect or mandatory. So you have any comments on that?
Well, so I think what you're saying is certainly consistent with what I've heard from others.
We have a saying in the businesses, we're too small to succeed.
Yeah. So I chatted recently with a friend of mine who's a board member of a small to mid-sized entity, but unfortunately I don't know what the terms mean, and I don't know how the size compares to yours. But he was saying, well, they're gobbling up smaller places because of this, but they have no idea whether they're going to be a survivor or not. Now. So I think my reaction is, well, on the one hand, that we should be sensitive to this because of issues of competition, because of issues of wanting to avoid too big to fail, and wanting to avoid concentration, whether antitrust related or systemic risk related. On the other hand, if there are natural scale economies. If these regulations are really truly necessary, and then if that's the case, then there are natural scale economies, and with scale economies, there are a lot of businesses where there's obviously natural monopolies or scale economies or the like. And what the balance is here, I'm not sure. I do think one of the things I've heard repeatedly over the last decade in banking is how difficult it is for creditworthy people to get loans, and how much paperwork they need to go through in the current era, and that I've heard in a number of situations people even made judgments, decide not to even go ahead and get the loan, to just sort of self-finance, because of all the complexity involved. In fact, there was now I don't think he chose the self-financing route, but there was a famous story shortly after Ben Bernanke left the Fed, which I think he told as a joke at a dinner speech, where where he had just moved over to the Brookings Institution, and a lot of his income was in the form of speaking fees, but there wasn't so much history, and so wherever he applied to refinance his mortgage, they rejected his loan, and I think he offered this up. I think it is an example of the fairness of the system. At least that's why I think that's what he had in mind when he offered this example of. I think it kind of illustrates a little bit more the stupidity of the system. But there's challenges. Look, if we're going to have, ultimately, if we're going to have a set of rules that apply to the, but there is a real issue about. There is an issue about burden. There's an issue about the consequences. I don't know that these issues have been so well. Not only am I unsure whether they're sorted out so effectively up front, maybe more strikingly, there's so little attention after the fact to assessing these issues. I think that's maybe the more surprising, and I think that's a front on which we really could maybe make much more headway, to do much more in the way of retrospective reviews. This is not a serious part of the regulatory process, and I think that's I think is very unfortunate. So do you have a mini
just
question?
very brief.
Yeah.
So many of the terms you use are very near and dear to us at SFI. You're using complex and simple and robust, and we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to formalize those concepts. And I'm just curious, and especially in relation to the question Gillian asked, and this your cost-benefit notion of diminishing marginal returns on benefit of accreting regulation, but the fact the superlinear scaling in cost or whatever it is. So, what do you mean when you talk about complexity and simplicity? Are you just using those in some colloquial sense, or do you have a rigorous sense of what you mean when you talk about the complexity of regulation?
No, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair critic. I think like all the earlier questions, I think that's a fair question too. So am I using it in a colloquial sense? Yeah, that's my training is not in terms of the formal aspects of complexity. My training isn't in terms of the formal aspects of complexity. But I've tried to use the terminology in a way that I think is consistent with the spirit as best as I can. But
Is it lines of text?
what?
Is it, in other words, you are using it in some sense, though. Is it lines of text? Is it, if you were to compress the text, a set of logical conditionals? There must be some sense of what you mean in terms of the regulatory scheme.
Well, I think to some extent I have in mind how detailed and prescriptive are the rules. What are the difference? To what extent are there a whole range of different regimes? What are the triggers? So it is a bit in the spirit of what you're suggesting, but I've not tried to formalize it. I guess maybe the best I could say is, and I know this is not really a politically correct answer, but I guess that I would say is I would quote the late Justice Potter Stewart.
That's not an acceptable explanation in this room.
I know, and it's not acceptable because because I'm basically saying I'm not bringing a formal definition to bear. But
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chester. And we're going to have